I'm really delighted to be here. Many years ago, I spent many afternoons in this very room. Of course, the technology wasn't as sophisticated at that point. So it's exciting for me to be back and see how the faculty and student body and mission of the university has evolved. Cornell's a really exciting place to be. So I'm going to talk to you today briefly about some of the work that we've done in South Asia. I've titled the talk Resolving Development Dilemmas in the Staple Cropping Systems of South Asia, because that's what I've been doing for the last 9 years. This is aspirational, right? Not saying that we've resolved things, but more talking about some of the principles and insights that have emerged as we've worked through some of these issues. Julie reminded me that I need to reserve some time for questions, so I won't go into too much depth. Also, the key to public speaking, of course, is knowing your audience, and this is my first month. So bear with me. You may need more information, or you may need less, but if there are any questions that emerge while I talk, please don't hesitate to put up your hand, and I'll do my best. Okay, so why South Asia? How many people have been to South Asia? I know some have gone on the trip. So many of you know. In South Asia, we've got about 1.5 billion people. This is a huge population. And things are changing fast. I'm highlighting here in green the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which is the alluvial plains in South Asia that compose the breadbasket region of South Asia. But as I said, things are changing quickly. Labor markets are constricting, which is both positive and negative. We have areas of significant resource depletion. We have increasingly erratic climate patterns. We have very little land in reserve to expand agricultural into. Essentially, what can be cropped is already cropped. And if you look at the distribution of extreme poverty, the numbers came out again the other day. The number of people living on less than $1.90 per day is higher in the eastern part of the Indo-Gangetic Plain than anywhere else globally. India has more extremely poor people than any other nation around the world. So these are regionally and globally important production ecologies and really agricultural systems on the edge for the reasons that I've described. It's important to note, though, within the EIGP, or the Indo-Gangetic Plain, there's a lot of heterogeneity. This is not one production ecology. And I'm just highlighting here, based on some of the mapping work we've done, some characteristics of the breadbasket region in Punjab, Haryana. Oh, sorry, Julie. Pointer? No. Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP, where farms are large, irrigation's assured, procurement's assured, and we're reaching towards the edge of attainable yield, versus areas in the east where yields are much lower, lands are fragmented, risk appetite of farmers is lower, but extremely different production ecology. And you have to treat these things different as you understand the opportunities for sustainable intensification. Here we're talking about resolving resource degradation issues, environmental quality issues, and maintaining high productivity. In the east, we're trying to figure out how we get to sustainable intensification at scale. Credit markets, land aggregation, all those other sorts of factors. So it's just important to recognize that this is a very diverse place. Okay, so when we start programming in an area like this, we start with technologies, and this goes back many decades to try to say, okay, what do we have in the toolkit? We know that sustainably intensified systems aren't just contingent on yield. You have to be thinking about water productivity and energy utilization and risk and stability. And the good news is that in our toolkit, because of the work going back to the Green Revolution days, but carried forward by people like Peter and John and Julie, we have a lot of technologies in our toolkit that, when applied together, can increase yield while reducing energy use, decreasing irrigation, increasing stability at the same time, and crucially, increasing profitability. And in some ways, in years past, we would have said, this is enough. This is, we've solved the problem. But it's important to recognize that where we are now is not just conceptually sufficient to understand what works. We're interested about scale. How to bring these innovations that have been devised through laboratories and controlled trial field experiments and bring them to large numbers of smallholder farmers. So impact is broad-based adoptions of innovations with the technologies as the starting points. Okay, so a brief review. What do we mean when we say sustainable intensification? What we're talking about is an outcome objective, not as technology, right? We're trying to achieve something. SI technologies or approaches acknowledge trade-offs and seek solution spaces that balance production, social, economic, and environmental goals. These are not generalized. They have a context to them. Success is defined by metrics and indicators, not just somebody's opinion. And it's not absolute. We're after more sustainable with acceptable risk, cost, and scaling potential because it's not good enough to have something that sits in a corner. We want broad adoption. And these things typically require an innovation systems approach because it's an orchestration of several changes. I won't go into this, but the organization that I worked with, the organization that Peter worked with, is an organization called CIMMYT, headquartered in Mexico, and CIMMYT and other CG partner centers have a host of sustainable intensification programs around the globe. The one that I was a part of, and Cynthia Mathis was also a part of in South Asia, was the CISA project, the Cereal Systems Initiative for South Asia. I've given the web address there where you can find out more what that's about. But many of the examples I'll be talking about today emerge from CISA. Okay, so I'm dividing this into 4 cases for purposes of discussion. And the first case I want to talk about is environmental trade-offs in the breadbasket of Northwest India. So that's that area on the map that I showed you where yields are very high, farmers are large, and that really is the granary for South Asia. And the case here that I want to talk about is environmental trade-offs in this ecology. This is actually a graph of groundwater abstraction on an annual basis in India. So this is the whole of India from Kashmir to the northeast all the way down south. The color code indicates the balance between abstraction, how much water is taken out of the aquifer every year, and recharge. And what you can see is that the areas in red, abstraction actually exceeds recharge, which means you have a situation of declining water tables. And this has profound implications for sustainability, including the utilization of energy that's required to lift the groundwater and pump it for irrigation. And of course, there's trade-offs also with other non-agricultural uses. There's a lot of municipal water supplies that have been compromised because of the over-abstraction that's been primarily driven by agricultural use. So what do? This is the most important area of South Asia for grain production, and we know that water resources are being unsustainably depleted. So, maybe 20 years ago, Peter knows the exact dates better than I do, people started thinking we have to do something about this. What do we do? Well, everybody knows that, I should say these are mostly rice wheat systems. Everyone knows rice uses a lot of water, right? Rice is a thirsty crop. So that was the first thing that was tried in these ecologies, to say we need diversification. That the rice wheat system that came up, the rice component in particular, is unsustainable. We need to move beyond this. And so lots of public investment has gone into managing this transition to go from here to here. But there are 2 things that I want to highlight here that are a bit problematic. Can you tell me, is irrigation the same thing as, or someone tell me the difference between irrigation water use and consumptive water use? Don't look at the slide. Who knows the difference? Consumptive water use is what's lost from the system, right? Lost to the atmosphere or lost to degraded aquifer, like a saline aquifer that couldn't be recovered for productive use. So it's essentially taken out of the system. A colleague of mine who I worked very closely with, Balwinder Singh, looked at this difference between irrigation and consumptive water use. If you look at it on an irrigation basis, rice wheat versus maize wheat, this transition saves about 75% of the irrigation water. But if you look at consumptive use patterns, that difference is reduced to 15%. So yes, there's benefit to be had, but it's not as significant as once thought when you actually look at the physical processes around water loss from the systems. The other thing is that there's not a lot of incentives for diversification because public procurement in this part of India is very strong. So you have free electricity and a guaranteed market for rice, and that doesn't exist for maize. So a lot of farmers have said no to this transition. What there's been more success with in these ecologies is trying to get farmers to change the way that they grow rice. This is essentially the annual water balance. The bars are precipitation and the stars are pan evaporation. And you can see that pan evap is extremely high right before the rice season starts. So in May and June before the monsoon rains come, and this is also before the rains come, and the evaporative demand is extremely high. So if you plant a crop here, you need irrigation. There's no way around it, and you need quite a lot of it. In 2009, there was a policy reform that was implemented that essentially shifted the planting window from here to here to take advantage more of rainfall and to take advantage of the fact that evaporative demand was lower. And by and large, those changes have been somewhat successful in at least moderating the amount of groundwater decline that's happened. So what I want to talk to you about in this case study is, in part, what are the implications of this beyond water resources? Because groundwater depletion is also not the only thing that is changing in this ecology. Who's been to Delhi in November? Could you breathe? Yeah. Awful, right? I rode in a rickshaw. I didn't take this picture, but I rode in a rickshaw last year across town, and I think I was sick for 3 weeks after because the air pollution is just horrendous. And of course, so as I said, this area of northwest India it's highly intensified, so the straw load from agriculture is actually very, very high. And there's a decoupling between the cropping systems and the livestock. Those linkages are no longer as strong as they are in the east. So you get the situation at the end of rice season where you've got all this straw and nothing to do with it. And I should say that here's Delhi, the NCR, the capital region, and this is the airshed that contributes to, well, essentially air quality in Delhi post-monsoon. And you can sort of see that this is actually active fires after rice harvest, and the airshed that contributes to Delhi. This is associated with this. So we're trying to look a little bit at the contingencies between the two. So what did we learn? Groundwater policy actually changes the phenology of rice. You've got, this is pre-implementation of the policy, this is post. It's shifting it to later in the season, and it's condensing into a shorter period of time. This has led to a shift in the burning pattern. So the burn, rather than happening at the end of October, is now happening in early to mid-November, where air is stiller and the conditions that favor pollution are more apparent. And you can see this also in the pollution, the air quality monitoring data. There has been, this is before the acts were implemented, this is after. You can see PM 2.5, which is the most damaging form of pollution, has essentially had a step change in November. So the upshot here is that sometimes when we're resolving one development challenge, we may be creating or exacerbating another. And that we need to think beyond the field scale as we go for some of these interventions or contextualize them appropriately. Okay, so I better speed up a little bit. I think I'm already behind schedule. But the second case that I wanted to talk to you about today is managing time in the rice wheat rotation. So again, going back to the theme of diversity in the landscape, this is actually Bihar. which is kind of at the edge of the map that I showed you earlier. What I'm showing you here are the distribution of planting dates. The distribution of harvest dates for rice. You can see there is a tremendous amount of variation, and this variation ranges from early November to late December. Why do you think this matters? Does this matter? Okay, I'll show you why it matters. This is why it matters. This is actually wheat yield as a function of planting date. Time management really matters in these systems, right? So you've got landscape diversity for a variety of reasons, and then you have implications for the crop. So if you look at this, this is simulation work that we've done in the APSIM modeling framework to look at overall productivity in rice-wheat systems as a function of planting date. The red series here, these bars represent what farmers usually do. They're usually planting the rice crop in August. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And one is a aversion to capital investment. So they don't want to invest in irrigation rather than waiting for the rains. But this pushes the cropping calendar quite substantially later into the year, which has knock-on effects. So you can see an optimized solution here with transplanting in between late June, mid-July, versus what happens in most situations, which is transplanting in August. And at a systems level, you're talking about a yield reduction of about 33% in terms of yield potential. So if farmers do this, even if they manage every other factor of productivity perfectly, there's only so much they're going to get out of their system, and there's more interannual variability. So the risk component is also exacerbated. And we verified this at the farm level through crop cut experiments with state university colleagues and others in the system so that they can understand and endorse these insights. The date of establishment for wheat explains almost 50% of the yield variation that you see among farms in this ecology. So we've also looked at this from the perspective of the farmer, because it's one thing to say you should plant early, but it's another to say, well, why, to understand why. So these are survey results from Bihar that a colleague of mine, Alan Kyle, led on. And I'm showing two time slices. One, when we started programming intensively, so like a baseline approach in 2010 to 2012, and another in 2013 to 2015. The good news is that more farmers, you see the first line there, more farmers understood that early planting is important. So we closed a knowledge gap. It went from 37% to 13%. So a significant change in perception of value. But you also notice a couple other things. If you plant Y, the most important factor is, well, the rice is still there, right? So the system's perspective. They can't plant because they made other choices earlier on, and that's locked them into a certain set of practices for the second crop in the rotation. There's also things like waterlogging that are inconsistent from year to year. You know, the climate pattern changes from year to year, and in some cases, in some landscape positions, this is also a binding constraint. So when we want to think about the value of some of these practices, it has to be contextualized from a systems perspective and also understood from a binding constraints perspective. But to address this, it's one thing to acknowledge it. We've closed the knowledge gap. That's driven some behavioral change. But we're also thinking about, well, how do you manage the rice phase more successfully to optimize things from a systems perspective? And we worked on things like shorter duration, early rice establishment, how to do that, mechanization processes, and of course things like zero tillage for wheat. But at the end of the day, over the last 5 years, we've transitioned more than 800,000 hectares towards earlier planting. It's estimated by satellite information. And the upshot here is that single crop focus usually isn't the way to go. You have to take a systems perspective to get the entry points for sustainable intensification right. Okay, my third case, scaling mechanization technologies among smallholders. So who's familiar with the Valley of Death concept? You heard this before? Anybody? All right, this is a different graphic.
Oh, okay.
It's the same concept, but a different graphic. So, in a nutshell, development resources are here. Primary research activities, popularization activities and demonstrations, maybe seed monies from social enterprises. A lot of things get to this point where we're not talking about scale. Nobody's really adopting a technology. Do you know what I mean when I say adoption? We do demonstrations where projects are supporting farmers to look at something or evaluate it. But when we talk about adoption, we're talking about farmers making their own decisions, making their own investments. The sustainability dimension is there. Usually, for many technologies, we get stuck down here at the phase of technology introduction and evaluation and demonstration without autonomous adoption, without people saying, hey, this makes sense and I know how to invest, I'm going to invest in a technology. And so you peter out towards a lack of success. Whereas what we're trying to drive for is farmers coming forward, making their own investments and getting virtuous cycles of investments and self-sustaining growth and adoption of technologies at scale. But this is extremely important for mechanization solutions because we're talking about them in the context of smallholders, cash-constrained smallholders who typically cannot afford many of the innovations independently. Even before that, though, there are issues around the quality of products. Often we assume things are perfect, and then we don't know why farmers don't adopt them. So this is a small tractor platform, a two-wheel tractor platform, and paired with a zero-tillage seed drill on the back, this unit here. Take a look at this thing. Does this look easy to use? Does this look like something that you would purchase if you were a farmer? This is the design that we revolved around for the better part of a decade. Notice the guy stubbing his toes on the back of the implement. Notice how big the thing is. You try to turn this at the edge of the field, picking it up and turning it. My goodness, this is not user-friendly. So in the last couple of years, a colleague of mine, and Peter knows well, Scott Justice, led a process of co-design with manufacturers to say, well, what can we do differently? And you notice that this unit is more compact, it has plastic components, so it's lighter. The usability is stronger, and at the same time, we work to reduce cost. So sometimes you just don't have the right product, and you have to be, we collectively have to be aware of that there are reasons that people are not adopting. So yes, we've worked in some cases to develop better products. But it's also important to realize that mechanization innovations function in an ecosystem. It's a commercial system, and that requires or has components that include credit providers and mechanics and dealers and field-based sales officers and service providers and backstopping by extension. All these things, in many cases, need to be somewhat coordinated to generate impact. And it doesn't mean projects and development organizations have to do everything, but you have to be cognizant of the ecosystem that you're working in to drive change. Using some of those principles, we've had some success in propelling greater adoption of sustainable intensification technologies like zero tillage. Zero tillage is essentially a no regrets innovation. It's a component of what is broadly referred to as conservation agriculture, consistent yield gains of a half ton per hectare, and also a profitability gain of $100 per hectare pretty consistently when accessed through service providers. But the question has been, we were at this for many, many years, and we were limping along. And mostly in the domain of technology demonstrations and promotion by extension. But with a more deliberate approach that includes an emphasis on service providers and a recognition of the role of others in this mechanization value chain, we've been able, with the strong contributions of partners, we're just a contributor to this, reach an inflection point. We've seen growth pattern in Bihar and Eastern UP. We have more than 4,000 service providers that have been supported. And in turn, those service providers are reaching about 75,000 hectares now. So we're reaching inflection points when we've taken a more comprehensive approach to development. But we're also learning things about the service economy as we go. Not all service providers are created equally. It's really the smaller service providers who have an incentive to make money out of service provision that are more likely to grow their business. We've also learned that service providers first will cater to larger farmers. So there's a scale bias. And if you think back at what I said about sustainable intensification, equity is part of the package that you're after, ultimately. Equity didn't look so good when we started to develop this model. But with time and with the maturation of the market, those dynamics seem to be reversing. And it's also, we've learned some important lessons about how knowledge exchanges, knowledge of the technology conditions adoption through service provision and how it flows in communities. Many of our approaches in the past have been predicated on the landlord, the bigger farmer in the village. Well, it turns out that knowledge flows in these areas don't work that way, that there's actually much more connectivity and trust among or within social strata, and you have to identify champions at different levels to essentially get more people interested. So we're trying to be a bit quantitative also about the adoption dynamics and take the longer view as these markets develop. In India context, I won't go into detail here, but the policy environment matters greatly because the state is providing a lot of subsidy and people become very passive about making investments in small businesses and technology adoption without that subsidy component. Again, I won't go into details, but we're trying also to figure out, well, how do you get the subsidies to jumpstart markets rather than being an impediment for market development? And we have some work in Odisha that's about looking at entrepreneurship propensity and how that potentially could be either targeted as part of subsidy schemes or conditional cash transfers that would reward people for more fully utilizing the machinery that they get on subsidy for inclusion for business development. Okay, I won't go into this one other than to say this is an example from Nepal that sometimes even in proximate ecologies, these areas in the Terai of Nepal are very similar to the areas we worked in Bihar, and we've had no success getting zero-till drills to move with very similar approaches adjusted to local circumstances. But there are technologies that work, and I'm showing an example here of a front-mounted reaper. Labor is becoming a constraint in all these areas, but this is much lower cost than the ZT drill. So sometimes you just have to be very cognizant of where you're working, how farmers and entrepreneurs are responding to price point, and rally around the solutions that is essentially the right product or innovation for that ecology at its stage of development. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Oh, well, there's my upshot. I'm trying to do an upshot for each of these. The upshot here is while scaling principles are more or less universal, finding best fit technologies is really critical for driving success and adoption at scale. Okay, I think I'm doing okay on time, more or less 110. All right, here's my last case, and this is representative of work that really we've started to do much more intensively in the last 6 months or so. Project design, the broader title of this case is Project Design for Impact, Understanding the Limits of Big Budgets and the Best of Intentions is what I'm calling it. And the case I'm using here is the Soil Health Card Initiative. For those of you that were in India last month, who knows about the Soil Health Card Scheme? Have you heard of the Soil Health Card Scheme? No? Okay, so this was an initiative that was started in 2015 to essentially bring customized solutions to every farm household in India through a massive soil sampling campaign. And the information is structured in the form of a card that's meant to be delivered to each household and as I said, predicated on the soil tests that were done. The overall budget for this scheme is $85 million. And there's a lot more sort of cost, not even cost share, but non-cash contributions that are also part of the scheme because this is taking up a massive amount of time of the extension staff in India. So if you go to any State Department of Agriculture from the center to the district level, they talk about this and they're kind of staggering because in some, 50 million soil samples have been taken and more than 65 million cards have been distributed since 2015. So this represents a massive commitment by the Indian government to bring essentially customized solutions to households across the country. The ambition is that everybody is reached and everyone feels like their resource base is being characterized and targeted through the scheme. So, what could go wrong? Turns out lots of things can go wrong. You know, with ambitious programs like this, lots of things can go wrong. The first thing is that, as I mentioned before, state extension is responsible for collecting the soil samples. And essentially this is an unfunded mandate where they had all these other things that they had to deliver and now they have to coordinate massive soil sampling campaigns. And this is no mean task. They do this sampling on a grid. It's in irrigated ecologies. It's at one sample every 2.5 hectares and rain-fed is one every 10 hectares. But you get the picture. This is a massive logistical undertaking with lots of explicit and implicit expense. But we also, in India or anywhere, don't have the laboratory infrastructure to deal with this. So essentially you're going from a level of, yes, we're doing soil assessment to, yes, we're assessing the entire country without really thinking about the infrastructure investments required to see that happen, both in terms of physical capital and human capital. So we're moving 50 million soil samples through laboratories that are unprepared. And so in many cases, we're not getting good data on the other side. The reliability is low because the laboratory's been asked to do too much. The other thing is that scientists design these cards, not development professionals. There's no participatory element to the development communication strategy. So you've got a card that's highly scientific, that has fields for X, Y, Z, 13 different soil parameters, but not an orientation to driving behavioral change. And this should be about behavioral change. And this is something that afflicts many development projects in India and beyond. There's not really any M&E. So nobody really knows if it's working, if it's not working. The metric of success of the program is actually cards delivered, not behaviors changed. So lots of things can go wrong. This is a massive positive commitment by the Indian government, but a lot of constraints kind of implicit in the design. And the surveys that we've done on this suggest about 4% of the households that are receiving soil health cards, don't quote me on this, 4% are actually changing a practice on the basis of the information they received in the card. So lots of scope for improvement. I'm going to highlight some work that we're doing on building a soil intelligence system in India. Very quickly I'll go through this. That's oriented towards supporting soil health card as one of the use cases. This is funded by the Gates Foundation and we're doing it in collaboration with the Bihar and the AP state governments. Okay, so part of the solution on this is technological and it's data organization. So our premise here on this is what if a small fraction of the current soil sampling could be conducted while improving reliability, reducing cost, and making soil information available for a range of use cases. And the way that we're doing this, you can see kind of our project cycle here is establishing a geospatial framework for soil evaluation that's oriented towards application. So we're not treating it just an information service, but we're calling it intelligence because we want people to do something with the data. And we're not there yet, but that's the standard that we're adhering to. But the project cycle quickly is understanding your use cases and seeing that through the project cycle, leveraging all the soil data that we already have through predictive mapping by combining that with satellite information, targeting sampling in areas where you don't have certainty, so understanding the landscape and not trying to sample everywhere in a gridded pattern, using end-to-end digital solutions, barcoding, or QR coding and things like that so that you have fewer laboratory errors, introducing things like spectroscopy that allow high throughput and high reliability in labs, and then treating this as a living ecosystem that's set up for use so that when you need soils information, everyone knows where to get it, they know what the metadata standards are, they know what the error terms are for each pixel. So we are working with partners to establish these systems in 2 Indian states. And sorry, that's pixelated, but we've created first generation digital soil maps, both for Andhra and Bihar, that's leveraged a lot of the data, the quality data that's come in through Soil Health Card Initiative and the All India coordinated schemes and this predictive mapping framework. Okay, so it doesn't, the main thing that we need though from soils is not just soil information, right? We're not managing in most cases soils for soils themselves, we're managing for crop response. And so it turns out when you look at some of these things, the relationship between background levels of things like zinc and response to zinc fertilization is weak. So there's a lot of progress that needs to be made on the science for translating soil diagnostics into crop response and better management as well. I'm happy to talk more about this offline later. I'm a little bit running out of time. We're tackling this through a couple of different perspectives. You don't want to do this kind of research on station. Stations have soils that have been managed in a certain way that are not necessarily representative, so we're trying to move the experimental design to the landscape, and we're doing that in cases with paired plots, but we're also using survey-based landscape diagnostic techniques and data mining to try to untangle the story about the way that soils are managed and the way that they are formed and what we can expect from any given management intervention. We've also tried to clean up the soil health card itself a little bit, to try to go into communities and understand through a participatory process what farmers understand, where they find what the gaps are in these communication materials, and how things can be redesigned. We've done this with state partners because at the end of the day, it's not about what the external research community does, it's about what state partners can own. And so it's important that you do a deep engagement up front to make sure everyone comes along in a journey. This is with the Ag Minister of Bihar. We've redesigned the thing and we're doing analytics now to say, well, okay, when these better products are in place, how does comprehension change? And ultimately, of course, how does behavior change? This is work that PAD has done, Precision Ag for Development, that also highlights the importance of backstopping. That it's not enough just to give somebody a card with better information. You have to launch and you have to provide backstopping of contextualization. Why should people pay attention to this? Is this what should motivate them to onboard recommendations that are on the card? The good news is they've looked at a variety of sources of information that bolster comprehension. I won't go into the details here, but the good news is that audio-based systems through IVR, video-based systems, and a personal visit from an agronomist actually are about the same in terms of their efficacy for increasing comprehension. So we can really start looking at multiple models of doing this and reinforcing from multiple angles. Of course, the audio and video are much more scalable because they're lower cost. Okay, so in SIS, we are, brief summary, modern tools, accessible data organized for impact. We're trying to do more science, different types of science to link soil information with crop response and to guide the development of new types of recommendations. And we're trying to make sure that we have a living geospatial framework so this kind of information is accessible to all the different types of folks from policy to field level that could benefit from it. Okay, last comment, I think. Yes, I'm almost there, Julie. When you think about driving better decision making in agriculture, it's also important to recognize that usually it's just not one thing that's going to change the equation. And I put up this slide to illustrate the data ecosystem that's required to drive better decision making around irrigation in the context of India. We started here, we developed an app like many do. The app works really well, it's kind of clever, it doesn't require too many parameters, and it can increase profitability and yields through more judicious use of irrigation. But what you need in the India context to make this run are historical and daily weather data. It comes from the Indian Indian Met Department. You need crop condition data from satellite platforms. You need, in many cases, information on groundwater from the groundwater board. And you need soil properties and soil physical properties, which usually aren't collected. So this one decision is not just about getting a better soil intelligence system, it's about creating a data ecosystem to support that. And it's important that we start thinking about issues of interoperability and how these data assets can be combined through fair principles to drive better decision making in agriculture. So my upshot for this case is that big schemes to scale, SI practices often fail, but smart analytics, new technology, and rapid prototyping hold the promise of increasing the return on investment of these initiatives, but that for many decisions, data systems integration is absolutely essential. And with that, I'm very much out of time, and I'll say thank you and open for a couple questions.